Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kjaer and we're in the Senate Chamber of the Old Capitol Museum. Very happy to have you with us for this fourth part in our four-part series on cultural memory and commemoration. Tonight we'll examine cultural memory and commemoration by looking beyond the official story at alternative narratives representing alternative historical readings of events and at something called counter-memorials. My guests tonight are Jen Shook, just next to me here, a graduate student in the UI Department of English who's also connected with the Center for the Book. Nice to have you here, Jen. Thanks.
Thank you.
Next to her is Sarah Kanouse, and Sarah teaches in the UI School of Art and Art History in the area of media, social practice, and design. Nice to see you again.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you know, in the first segment of this program, I asked the question, what and why do we remember? And, you know, I think that's a good question for this segment as well, because we're talking about alternative histories, counter-memorials. Some people remember things one way, others remember them another way, or perhaps they haven't officially remembered them, and there are those in the world who would like to see some discussion arise around things that may have been forgotten in general by the public. So before we talk about counter-memorials, let's talk a little bit about memorials. Who creates them? Why are they created? What do they celebrate? Who wants to jump in?
Sure, I can start. So we have that phrase, history is written by the victors, and for the most part, monuments are also erected by them, in large part to shore up the victory, to celebrate the heroic acts of the generals, and to convince whatever vanquished people that these folks are worthy of memorializing, worthy of their power, and all of that. But things don't always go as planned, right? And monuments change their meaning over time through people interacting with them. And so very often those monuments that are erected are challenged and contested in various ways by people around them. A really good example of this would be the Haymarket Police Monument in Chicago. Following the Haymarket Square event in 1886, which involved a bomb going off at a political rally, the execution of a number of anarchist organizers, and one of our original Red Scares, the police department erected a heroic monument to the police who were killed. This monument was bombed by activists so many times that it eventually had to be removed from public view and back into the police station. So there was already, you know, with official monuments, an active dialogue and challenge that percolates up from below.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The Haymarket example is such a good, rich one to start with, because there also is another Haymarket memorial that was erected in a cemetery that a large number of public memory rituals and commemoration practices grew up around that particular statue. So there's this question of what is forgotten. There's the question of what did the memory mean to the, we often say that monuments tell you more about the people who make them than the thing that they're supposed to be about. Memories tell more about the person remembering than the thing remembered often. But then there's this question of how they change over time, how people use them, how people connect and gather around to them, how people question them. And of course, another terrific example of the rise of a somewhat official but still counter memorial in many ways is Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, which was built in 1982 and immediately questioned in many, many ways. But one of the things that fascinates me about the wall is the way that people's practices make much of what we think about it. If I think about the wall, the first time that I went there, I was watching how people behaved, not just looking at it like you look at a statue or a painting or even the way you would read a book or a work of history, but wanting to see how people interacted with it, and this concept that part of being there is making a rubbing of the name, or part of being there is leaving something. So there have been tens of thousands of things now left at the wall, which now in a sense are a part of that monument. So they so quickly and in so many different ways become so much more than what the original intention may have been.
Are there other examples of a memorial that has been put together in the last few years that you think gets to that same kind of sort of interactive element that you have with the Mile End Memorial? Can you think of any other?
Recent official memorials, or I can think of a lot of unofficial memorials that have that built into them, and many of them are quite oppositional and have only sort of more recently become integrated into the fabric of the society that they originate from. So one of the things that I, as an artist and an activist, look to a lot is the movement, the Madres, the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, and these were women whose children were disappeared by the military dictatorship. And in a country where there was no political protest available to them, they used their mourning, their acts of mourning, as a form of protest. They embroidered baby clothes, baby blankets with the names of their loved ones who were killed, put them on as a kerchief, the grandmother's kerchief, and then just simply walked and paced. And from there was born a political movement that helped to topple the dictatorship. Right, so that is a form of bottom-up commemoration that actually is unseating the victors rather than sort of edifying them.
Yeah, incredible. So when we think about cultural memory, the memorials, you go to any, think of a city that has a lot of wonderful statues on them. You can, I know if you go to England or someplace, it's not my native home, and so I'll see a statue of someone whose name would probably mean something to at least an English historian, but it's not anything that resonates with me. And I would look at it probably for whatever artistic value I thought there was in it, or the pose or something, but I wouldn't carry any story with me related to that statue, which doesn't make it, invalid in any way. It's just not meaningful to me. Why do we build such things?
Right, that's one of the great questions, is what do you want a monument or memorial or any work of art or literature to do? And if you want it to constantly remind you, that becomes a problem after a while, because we don't naturally constantly remember things, particularly difficult moments of our past. So the traditional monuments built by the victors, the big stone obelisks, if we think of things like early war monuments before World War I, before they really even were faces, but they were great stones that said, something heroic happened on this date. We didn't have to think about them. That was the whole point, is that they were already, their work is to make us all agree and say, yes, that was a great moment in history, right? Whereas some of these alternative bottom-up monuments and memorials that have happened within the past few decades or so, in what the scholar Erica Doss has called memorial mania. She actually dates it back in some sense to 2001, but many people can easily date it back to Mile End. And frankly, many of the practices go back even farther than that, the way that often very contemporary artists who work in things like fragmentation are drawing upon really early forms like classical odes, where you have whole lists of names, right? Like the names on the wall, the names in the AIDS memorial quilts, which is another favorite example of mine, of a bottom-up, people saying, well, but what about us? We're not included in the major story, so how do we get included? And much like the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, drawing upon an old traditional form, a really domestic, in some ways, not only not official, but maybe even a little old-fashioned form quilting. But Cleve Jones, who initially got the idea for the Names Foundation memorial quilt, said, I knew it had to be a quilt because there would be some sort of equality of the pieces and the people remembered, but it also would allow people to come together to make it. So then you start getting at these questions of who is the artist? not only who gets a say in the decision of how is it built and whose names are on it and where does it go, but who gets to actually pitch in and make it, who gets to actually be a part of it. And then, is it over at some point? And you say, there, that thing has been remembered, therefore we no longer have to think about it anymore? Or do you say, as people say with the quilts, no, the work is actually to keep remembering this thing because it's still affecting lives today, and it will keep affecting. And there actually is a square that is meant to be the last square of the quilt.
Really?
There's a documentary film being made about it right now that has not been put in yet.
Yeah.
But the hope that the people who work on the quilt is that someday this last panel will be able to be sewn in. And I don't know, I work myself a lot with Native memory and hear people saying, you know, it's on the basic level of naming and language. What do you even call a site? So the difference between making the Custer battlefield site the Little Bighorn site, and the difference between thinking about that as a celebrational place or a place that consolidates people through symbols versus a place where people go and continually ask questions and really resist closure, resist the end of the story, but keep, you know, resisting a kind of Freudian grieving that it can be over and done with ever, but saying it's not over as long as living people are still affected by these same issues. So the past and the present and the future are so deeply intertwined in these counter memorials.
Yeah.
They're always at work.
Well, Sarah, let's talk a little bit about something you've been involved with. I know that you've had a charrette, which I'll ask you to describe to people here, but related to Cold War and an imaginary Cold War memorial.
Yes. So one of my creative projects, I am one of two co-directors of a wishful government agency known as the National Toxic Land and Labor Conservation Service. And we have been, we've charged ourselves with the mission of producing cultural programming surrounding the ongoing environmental, cultural, and human health impacts of the Cold War and the ongoing atomic weapons complex in the United States. And our primary program currently, which will continue for a few years, is to conduct what are called design charrettes, which is a collaborative workshop lasting 1 to 2 days, where we bring together people who are stakeholders in one way or another to talk about atomic legacies, many of which are still very, very present with us, to design ways of moving through these spaces. These are not the heroic spaces of, say, the Manhattan Project. These are mundane and everyday spaces that were involved in very, you know, supply chain, nuclear supply chain stuff, oftentimes over decades. Where did waste go? Where do people live? All of these kinds of questions. And then out of this kind of sharing and discussion process, we get non-artists and non-designers working with landscape architects, designers, drafts people to work on their own speculative monuments for the Cold War. And these have taken the form of anything from alternative bus tours to sort of activist earthworks, like to raise awareness of the impacts of improperly disposed nuclear waste outside of St. Louis. That was part of the Manhattan Project. To more, you know, things that are more what we think of as more traditional forms of monuments, like brass plaques in the ground and things like that. New media proposals, and we really are interested in the kind of face-to-face, discussion-based sorting out of these ideas, and then the rather rapid development of images that can then circulate beyond and form a series of propositions for this. We're less interested in realizing any one of the projects than we are in having many divergent narratives materialized in these drawings to become part of this living memory and public discourse around this, which, very little of which happens. Like the conventional narrative about the Cold War is that it ended, and that all of these legacies have been resolved. In the meantime, there are many people who are dealing with cancer still from occupational exposure or improper burial of wastes.
Yeah. Yeah. So who are some of the people who come to participate in the Charrette?
Well, we've only done one. Our first one was in October at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and we had about 17 participants, several from Chicago, a number from Central Illinois, and then about 5-6 people from the St. Louis area, including 3 women from an organization called the St. Louis Radioactive Waste Legacy Group, who are organizing around this landfill outside of St. Louis that's actually on fire that has radioactive barium leachate from the Manhattan Project waste, and working on getting that removed and adequate testing and monitoring of sites that are currently not sufficiently monitored.
Yeah. So when we talk about alternative histories, this is kind of what you were getting at. Well, you also, of course, but this is sort of what you were getting at with the reference to the Native American site. And,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the questions is, how can you involve voices, stakeholders, groups who normally are not included in the major dominant story of history? And the more I look at these counter memorials and alternative monuments and alternative commemoration practices, the more you see, again, the merging of the past, present, and future, but also this desire to keep adding more and more and more layers, more and more and more voices, right? The AIDS quilt is 96,000 panels as of, I think, the end of 2012, and almost daily they get new panels in. A panel being an individual, a piece made for an individual person, which may have been made by an individual or by a group. And one of the things that has been sort of driving my research on these questions, I was fortunate enough to work on putting together a symposium called Life After: Activist Memorials and Digital Collaboration back in October. And one of the things that we got to talk about was the digital AIDS quilt, the AIDS Quilt Touch, which is actually being worked on by the Digital Studio for Public Arts and Humanities here at the University of Iowa. And it was saying, okay, so the quilt clearly isn't meant to be permanent, but its need has lasted longer than its makers knew. And we want to keep getting more voices, and we want to keep asking who gets to change. What if someone wants to edit it? What if someone wants to add a story? How can we do that? And they said online is one of the ways to do it. Not only is it too big now to put out in public, but how can we give more people more access, more flow of information between them? And likewise, we had Mona Smith come to talk about the Bedote memory map, which is mapping Dakota memory in the Twin Cities, Minnesota area. And it seems that many activists are turning to, again, ritual and participation and commemoration and performance, but also the temporary can be really powerful. Mm-hmm. The monument that is not meant to last, but that is meant to say it will give way in the future to a new monument, that there will always be more memorials. And Joseph DeLappe, who is another of our guest artists, has worked on many, many interesting pieces, but the Iraqi Civilians Memorial is one where he said, I'm not going to make a memorial, I'm going to put out a continual, ongoing call for artists. And in a similar fashion, it doesn't matter in some way whether they get built. The point is that we keep a conversation going. So it becomes, back to Maya Lin's point, it's more about making a space where people are talking to each other, rather than coming, looking at something, going, yes, I agree, and leaving, but that we keep questioning and keep talking.
Yeah. And so tell me something about the area you work in. You work in media and media arts or digital arts.
I mean, I work at the intersection of expanded forms of documentary and a genre of contemporary art that's been called social practice. It's kind of the term that has been out there and seems to be sticking, right? It's been called other things too, but that one seems to have a little bit more durability. One of the tenets of social practice is that experiences, especially shared experiences with people, can be an artistic medium. We all know when we've had an experience that is beautiful, that is transformative, that is meaningful. And so over the last 30 years or so, and really accelerated quite a bit in the last decade, artists have been really trying to think about how can experiences be crafted in ways that are emancipatory for participants, so that authorship is often co-created. The artist creates a situation and then invites other people to participate in it, and ideally to contribute in a sort of meaningful way that is ultimately transformative that exceeds what the artist could have imagined for that work. So I'm sort of loosely aligned with those practices, and then sort of expansive forms of documentary that include sometimes photographic video work, writing, etc.
Does this sort of connect in some way with what used to be called happenings in the 60s?
Yeah, I think, some of the ancestors, progenitors, founding fathers, that's such a loaded word, of this way of working would include people like Alan Caprow, who did happenings. It would also include folks like Joseph Beuys. He coined this term called social sculpture, which anticipates a lot of work. I just assigned a Walter Benjamin article from the 30s, The Author as Producer, which I think really anticipates this social turn in art. He was very interested in calling on artists, writers, musicians, theatrical producers to not just think about the work that they were producing, but how that work would enhance other people's capacity for creative expression and political expression. Way back 80 years ago, he was already on it.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding this correctly, the thing that occurs on a given day, the memorial that might be made, might be ephemeral, might not be intended to last forever, might just be that thing that's there for a week. Or if you imagine something like the Wall Street opposition groups a couple of years ago, the tent cities and whatnot, there was a statement being made there. Some might have said that it was a collective, almost artistic expression of a different point of view. So it's not the fact that this particular thing lasts, it's that the conversation lasts and that the dialogue continues and that people continue to bring their own new thoughts into it. And
I would add to that the capacity to respond to an event or a set of conditions is really one of the things that a lot of these practices seek to keep open, to enhance the capacity for a response. Another thing maybe to add or think about is the relationship between commemoration of an event and commemoration of a condition. We have the obelisk to the victory. But how do we commemorate a condition of colonialism or a condition of atomic exposure? These things have no beginning and they have no end. But they structure so much of the social fabric of life that a single representation is violently reductive. And so doing things that involve dialogue and participation is really the only way to collectively sort through what these structuring conditions really have meant.
Pluralism, repeating the same questions, with different people, different answers, different potentials in each moment. The poet Muriel Rukeyser calls it exercise, that poetry, that literature, that art is meant to give us collective, cultural, individual and collective exercise of our own human capacities.
Wow, well, thank you guys for joining us in this discussion, alternative histories, counter memorials, and the whole notion of cultural memory and commemoration. It's been an exciting series, and we're glad you could be with us in this last program. Thank you also for joining us for this program, those here in the audience and anyone watching online or at home. The entire series on cultural memory and commemoration can be found online on YouTube, also on UITV, on iTunes, and the internet. International Programs website, international.uiowa.edu. I want to thank you all for being with us, and I hope you can join us for the next World Canvas when our topic is A Century of Film. We have some great guests for that program, and it's on February 21st. So for UI International Programs, I'm Joan Kjaer. Thank you very much, and see you next time.